Hello and welcome back to Politics and Polls. I'm Julian Zelizer, a professor of history and public affairs at Princeton University, and this is my co-host and colleague, Sam.
Hi, this is Sam Wang, professor of neuroscience and molecular biology and founder of the Princeton Election Consortium.
Well, I hope, Sam, that you had a little break in the last few weeks. Both of us took a little vacation time and hopefully refreshed our brains. As we probably could have predicted, the campaign has continued and it's taken all kinds of unusual twists and turns. There have been more email revelations that ensured the Clinton scandal stories would continue, debates about polls and their veracity, and more trouble that Republicans are feeling about the impact of Donald Trump on their potential to retain hold of the Senate. Donald Trump's tried a few times to move to the so-called center, backing off kind of his threats of mass deportations. He also remade his campaign team since we last spoke, bringing on one of the executives from Breitbart News in a move that surprised many people. In any case, today, Sam and I wanted to shift the conversation a bit and to bring in our first author interview in a wonderful new book from the world of academia that is triggering some interesting discussions about race and party politics. This is something that Sam and I both want to do as we bridge the worlds of the university and the public in terms of understanding what's going on in politics today. Our guest is Eric Schickler, who's a fantastic political scientist at the University of California at Berkeley, who's written a number of wonderful books and articles, including a classic on congressional reform. And he's recently published a book called Racial Realignment, The Transformation of American Liberalism, 1932 to 1965, with Princeton University Press. This is a powerful piece of work that offers a fresh reinterpretation of how and why African Americans became loyal to the Democratic Party, while Republicans became the party of racial conservatism. Welcome, Eric.
Thanks, Julian. Great to be here.
So I just wanted to start by going back to a famous story from the Lyndon Johnson presidency that always is mentioned in books about civil rights or Lyndon Johnson. And it took place the evening that Johnson signs the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which ends segregation in public facilities. And according to the story, one of his advisors, Bill Moyers, finds Johnson sitting in the Oval Office forlorn and looking defeated. And Moyers is stunned to see this because he thought the president should be celebrating rather than mourning what had happened. And when Moyers asks him what was wrong, the president said that predicted that they had just given away the South to the Republican Party for generations to come. And that story is told often because it captures a key piece of conventional wisdom in American politics about why Democratic support for civil rights in the 1960s led to this fundamental partisan realignment with Southerners going to the GOP. So I wanted to start, Eric, by just asking how your book challenges this conventional story and what the implications are of your challenge.
Sure, thanks. That's a great question. I think that when Johnson makes that statement, the key element of that is that it implies that it's really his decision to sign the Civil Rights Act and to push it through Congress that sets the South adrift from the Democratic Party. It gives him really the credit for just the tremendous gains Democrats would make among African Americans, and also for this tremendous achievement of moving the party towards civil rights. And I think what it misses is that Johnson, when he signs that bill, is really, it's more of a culmination than a transformation. His party had been remade below him over several decades, such that essentially any Democratic president at that time, given the pressures of the civil rights movement and given the party that he ostensibly is supposed to lead, would have had tremendous pressure to sign that bill. And Johnson's own move to push it to enactment was really done with keen awareness of the need to shore up his support on the left of the party and in the party base, rather than necessarily him bravely leading the party to somewhere new.
And I know Sam is eager to jump in, but let me just ask one more question here. So you don't start your story with the 60s, and that story of Johnson in some ways is a culmination. So where you start the story is in the 1930s with the New Deal, which you argue is really an important moment to understanding this realignment that's going to take place. And most people don't think of the 1930s and the New Deal as integral to race. It's more about economics, and then obviously with international relations. Can you talk a little bit about the impact that the 1930s and the New Deal had, especially on state and local politics? You want to do more than just correct our timing. I think you want to say something bigger about the period.
Sure. So I think that one thing that's worth noting is the starting point. If you look at what people understood liberalism to mean in 1932, it's quite clear civil rights and racial issues were not part of that standard understanding, either by elites or by journalists or at the mass level. What happens during the New Deal is, first of all, the CIO enters the Democratic Party and the Liberal Coalition and really becomes the central mobilizing instrument for liberalism in America.
And what's the CIO? Just for
the Congress of Industrial Organizations. It's a breakaway union from the old AFL. And unlike the AFL, the CIO is committed to inclusion of African American workers. They're far from perfect, but it's a sharp departure from the traditional labor movement. And the CIO is organizing African Americans and including racial issues on their lists of key votes in Congress, on the issues they organize based on. And so that sends a powerful signal of inclusion to African Americans. And so the second development alongside the entry of the CIO is that African Americans start to both join unions and especially in the North, start to vote Democratic. They start to enter this coalition. And it's clear that they're attracted to the Democratic Party, not by racial issues. Roosevelt is by no means a racial liberal, but by these economic policies you're talking about. So you start to get the CIO and you start to get African Americans in the party. And what's crucial is that then provokes a reaction by Southern Democrats, who essentially go from being loyal foot soldiers of the New Deal to deep skeptic of expansion of the New Deal state. And that combination of changes, the CIO is a central mobilizing force for liberalism, and Southerners becoming the main enemies of the expansion of liberalism, helps to forge a new ideological alignment in which racial issues essentially begin to be folded into economic debates, economic liberalism. So for example, for unions to survive, they need to defeat the Southern conservatives. And that gives them a common interest with African Americans on racial issues. So you start to see civil rights become a defining issue when, for example, groups are rating the liberalism of members of Congress. So that's happening at this kind of ideological level. You asked about state parties and locally rooted members of Congress. The key is that early on, the racial liberals are in no position to just simply take over the whole National Democratic Party. The conventional wisdom has something right, which is national party leaders like Franklin Roosevelt have a stake in keeping the South in the tent. And so they're not eager to embrace racial liberalism. But what happens is racial liberals go through state parties and through locally rooted members of Congress to kind of gradually take over the party from below.
But isn't it, let's see if I'm understanding this sequence of events correctly, another way of describing some of the things that you've described in your book is that neither party really did that much for African Americans, but they mostly voted Republican. The New Deal came along and finally did something for them, whether it was by design or as part of a program to help everybody who was in need. And then a labor organization and a figure in your book, Joseph Guffey, saw that it was possible to peel away African Americans from the Republican Party because somebody was helping them, and it wasn't the Republicans.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right. In terms of the part of the story that's the incorporation of African Americans, I think it's the combination of benefits from New Deal programs and then alliances forged often at the state level, as in the case of Guffey in Pennsylvania, working with Robert Vann, the editor of the Pittsburgh Courier, an African-American newspaper, very prominent at the time, to try to, persuade African American voters that this is a potential home for them in the Democratic Party. And then Pennsylvania, very early on, actually in the mid-1930s, under the Democrats, passes a civil rights law, public accommodations law, primarily through support from Democrats.
Was the CIO, so historians who look at the CIO often debate how progressive labor was in the 1930s and 40s. And there's this debate with some historians, I think more sympathetic to what your argument is, seeing the CIO as being at the forefront of the pursuit of racial justice, and others more ambivalent, other historians more ambivalent about what at least the rank and file was thinking in terms of racial integration. What did you find? You're making, I think, a big argument about the CIO. Can you tell us a little more about why labor, or why this union? Was it simply the pragmatic reasons you mentioned, or was there a genuine commitment to racial integration or some kind of racial justice?
Yeah, I think that there's both elements to it. There's certainly a pragmatism, the sense that to organize industrial workplaces, you had to include African Americans. I think that's a part of it. I think there also is an ideological commitment, particularly out of union organizers who come out of the left wing, out of the Communist Party and socialist movements. And those individuals, I think, did have a principled belief that racial inequality is really a tool used to exploit workers. And so we're committed to fighting for equality. So I think both aspects fit in. I think it's important not to exaggerate the racial progressivism, especially of rank and file workers, and even of some leaders. But what's crucial is, at the time, relative to the standards of the time, the CIO is really the first primarily white-led organization to show any real interest in racial equality. And it was understood that way by political observers at the time, political elites at the time, and also, I would argue, by a good number of citizens were able to take these cues as well.
I'm really interested in the fact that back in this time, before the signing of the Civil Rights Act, going back to the New Deal and to the labor movement, as you're describing, are the roots of current polarization. And I can't help feeling that one interesting aspect of this is that the political parties don't need to be polarized along lines of race. And yet this year in the campaign, what we're seeing is more than ever an explicit appeal to race on the side of the Republicans. That's sort of a counterpart to the fact that non-whites have pretty much clustered in the Democratic Party. Now there's a wing of white Americans, which it sounds funny to even say so, but now this wing of white Americans is now an interest group that's identifiably ethnic, that says, okay, this is our side and our home is the Republican Party. And you say that 1964 is a culmination, but it seems like all of these things go back to the labor movement, back to the 1930s, and have led in some ways a pretty strongly causative direction towards where we're at today. Does that seem fair?
Well, I think it's fair in the sense that one way to think about it is that the racial realignment is, in a sense, the first big shoe to drop, and then it makes the subsequent shoes that have dropped since much more likely. And what I mean by that is, prior to this realignment, really you could think about both parties as including both a strong urban and a rural element, both a strong socially more progressive and socially conservative element. And those internal splits meant that as new kind of socially divisive issues come along, both parties are going to be cross-pressured and divided. And I think what happens as, in particular, white Southerners enter the Republican Party, that leads the Democrats to really lose that rural, socially conservative part of the party. And as a result, as these new issues have come up, whether it's abortion, feminism, gay rights, gun control, it's done so in a context where you have this big clump of voters who are predisposed to take the conservative position, who are in the Republican Party, whereas the Democratic Party has much more been the party of kind of urban liberalism that takes a very different point of view on those kinds of issues. And so I think in that sense, you could see the parties taking the sides the parties have taken on all of these kind of explosive issues since the 1960s is kind of prefigured in what happens on the race issue in the 30s into the 60s.
I wonder if I could come back just, I don't mean to be piggy about the questions, but I want to come back to Lyndon Johnson. You portray him, at least in this discussion, as inflating his own involvement in this culmination of this great move from the 1930s to the 1960s. But I just want to push back on that a little bit and see what you say. It seems to me that he still didn't have to do what he did. So just to bring in some public opinion information, he was president immediately consequent to the Kennedy assassination, which is an event that dwarfs 9/11 as actually would be on a par with 9/11 in terms of moving opinion. And his approval ratings were very high at the time. So people really approved of him. So is it really the case that he had to or was under some pressure to take the steps that he did? And I'll bring in a second step, which is that second point, which is that it's been said by the biographer Robert Caro that Johnson had these predilections within him. He didn't have to be an advocate for civil rights, but once he became president, he used that wave of popularity to push through party items. And he had a choice of what to push through, and civil rights was one of the choices that he made. So I guess I would offer the counter suggestion that even though there's this great wave on the Democratic side driven by these events in the 1930s, it wasn't necessarily the case that it had to culminate in the 1960s. A more Democrat could have held that back for a while longer, it seems to me. So I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Well, I actually think that it was Johnson's Southern roots and that made him especially under deep pressure to really push civil rights, in the sense that what he was most afraid of was a challenge from the left, from Bobby Kennedy and the Kennedy legacy. And I think that given the distrust of liberals for him, I think when you read kind of transcripts of his conversations, what he wanted to do is prove I'm a good liberal, I'm a real liberal. And in that context, the way to prove it was to lead on civil rights. So I think you're right. I don't want to be too deterministic. It's certainly possible he could have failed to lead on civil rights and still won re-election, for example. But I think his perception of the best way to secure his leadership of his party was to prove himself to be a liberal. And that meant that he couldn't even make compromises on the civil rights bill that perhaps Kennedy could have gotten away with. And so he used, don't get me wrong, he had tremendous legislative skill, exercised tremendous leadership. But I think the key is that he had a very, very strong political calculus to do what he did.
Now, one of the terms we've been using, all of us, and you use obviously in the book, is political party. That's the subject and that's the focus. And I thought it was interesting that you want to challenge in some ways our views, our ways in which we think of political parties. And you do that by quickly pushing us to the state and local level rather than just the national story, the FDR through LBJ story. And how do you conceive of a political party as a political scientist studying it? What were you looking at? How did you structure that part of your inquiry to come away with the conclusions that you did?
Right. I guess my starting point in thinking about parties in America is that they're federal parties and they're parties that develop over time. So we need to think about them as historical composites rather than unitary actors. And I think there's been this tendency to ascribe either a single goal or a single set of groups as the core of a party. And I think what's striking about American parties, particularly at mid-century, is really that both parties were composed of dueling groups with very different agendas and very different policy visions, and they fought that out over time. And that fight was really structured by this federal party system and by the kind of geographic decentralization of how, for example, members of Congress are elected, that really allowed both sides to have a power base within the Democratic Party and then in its own way within the Republican Party, between those advocating a conservative vision and a union essentially with the South, and Northeastern Republicans who really saw that as potentially the death knell for their wing of the party.
Yeah, that seems so at variance with what we see on the current political scene, where now as parties have become nationalized, there's this polarization in which if you believe in a set of issues in New York as a Democrat, then you probably also believe those issues as a Democrat in Colorado, or as a Democrat in Florida, or as a Democrat in Arizona. And I think it's somewhat ironic that political scientists have decried, at least in past decades, the lack of clear issue stands at a national level of political parties. And now we have those, we have a level of coherence that you're describing as being missing 60 years ago, and we've got it in spades now. And now we're getting this national coherence, as Mencken would say, we're getting it good and hard.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. I think that the traditional adaptability of American politics was actually through this decentralization and fragmentation. So, for example, think about the rise of abolition on the agenda. When you had a party system structured around suppressing that issue, it actually happened through federalism, both through third parties and through movements within the existing party that gained power at the state level. You can think of other examples like the currency issue in the late 19th century, where a similar dynamic unfolded to what we then see again with civil rights. And I think the real problem, one of the real problems in American politics today, is that as the parties have become nationalized, the space for kind of dissatisfied movements to kind of bubble up from below has really been closed off in a lot of ways. And so then, arguably you get much more frustration when we essentially have just two choices across the country as a whole. You get a greater frustration, greater alienation. And I think I'd certainly agree with you that a generation of political scientists kind of missed some of the strength of this older decentralized kind of system for allowing a diversity of preferences to be expressed.
It's a real it is a reversal of the main arguments of the kinds of books I think Sam is referring to. The American Political Science Association's report, when was that, in 1950, about the need that parties needed to be more ideologically homogeneous, and Woodrow Wilson's critique back in the 19th century. And it seems that we have now witnessed through scholarship that as parties became more polarized, first there was a lament of the desires and wishes becoming fulfilled that a lot of political scientists wanted when the parties were fragmented. And your book actually shows how the fragmentation of this period didn't only create space for conservatism, which is what a lot of people, including myself, have written about, but also for more progressive and liberal impulses in American politics that I think we probably forgot about, or political scientists and historians at the time didn't really see.
Right. Yeah, and I think that's right. I mean, one way to think about fragmentation is that it's a substitute for third parties. And the American system is stacked against third parties having a chance to really introduce new ideas and have them gain a foothold in our politics. And in the absence of third parties, I think for generations, this fragmented political party system provided that kind of mechanism. And I think now you could argue we have the worst of both worlds. We have a system that's essentially shuts out third parties, and yet there isn't this alternative channel as well.
It feels like a deep cause of this is technological, in the sense that it's much easier for, say, Southern Democrats and Northern Democrats to hear the same set of opinions, or Northern Republicans and Southern Republicans. I mean, think of talk radio, think of cable TV, think of the internet as ways for people to get information conveniently over long distances. And I just wonder what life would have been like as a Southern Democrat, not having to deal with, I don't know, Northerners or Westerners or what have you, and not really having to have those opinions in their face.
Yeah, no, I think that's an interesting point. I think that in the 30s, one of the things you certainly see is with the rise of the CIO and then FDR's purge campaign in 1938, you see Southern newspapers become keenly aware of this threat. And so I think that one could say that the start of having a kind of national political conversation is one of the things that in some sense sets off this process, or plays an important role in this process. And certainly today, where it's much more immediate and it's more visceral with television and so on, that kind of pressure is only going to be magnified.
So in terms of that's an issue that touches on something I was thinking about. I was reading your book, and I'm thinking about all these discussions people are having about both political parties. In the Democratic primaries, there was all this discussion about will the Democratic Party evolve in response to the coalition that emerges with Bernie Sanders around the economic questions that came up? There's discussion, obviously, in the GOP. Will we see some kind of reconfiguration or redefinition of the party after Trump is gone, regardless of what happens to him? And your book is about how a party changes, certainly about the Democrats, how you see a long-term evolution in the issue agenda and even in the power structure within the party. Maybe you can connect these two a little bit and tell us what the book might offer us in terms of not understanding the specifics of 2016, but how do parties change? How do we, without a party disappearing, how do they fundamentally change their reorientation on the issues of a period?
Well, I think actually to take I think Trump is in a lot of ways a really interesting example, because one thing I think that we see with Trump is that there is a mass base, there is a popular base within the Republican Party for several of the views that he is, forcefully advocated, both in terms of immigration and in terms of trade, the kind of nationalism, the kind of fierce nationalism and appeals on racial issues that are more overt than the party has otherwise been doing. I think there's a popular base for it, just as in the New Deal period, I argued that there was a popular base for taking a more racially liberal position among the Democrats. I think one difference that we see with Trump is it's not clear that there's an organizational base for what he's arguing in the same way as there was with racial liberals in the 30s and 40s. In other words, there's the Trump personal movement, but is he poised to build organizations and networks in state parties or through members of Congress or other kinds of groups to then essentially have that set of views institutionalized and have an opportunity to kind of wend its way into the party in a more permanent way? I think we don't really see that with Trump so much. And so I think the question is, are we now in such a media-infused environment that you don't need that institutional building to change a party in a permanent way? I think in the 30s and 40s, you certainly did have that institution building going on. Now I think we don't, and I guess that would make me more skeptical of him being able to have that kind of long run impact. But I think with the caveat that in this media age, maybe you don't need it in the same way.
Well, I would turn around the argument that you make in Racial Realignment, your new book, that Trump himself is a culmination of movements that are occurring within the Republican Party. So, lacking an organization, lacking any apparatus, he definitely doesn't have any of those things. But what he has is attachment to media organizations. Getting back to what I was saying about the technology of information distribution, his campaign manager is now the publisher of a white nationalist website, and he makes more or less basically explicit appeals to race. And so clear, at least in this election, what pressure the Democrats would be under, if at all, to rearrange their coalition or to realign. I think the biggest sign of that on their side, seems to me, is their Democratic convention to reach out to Republicans who don't buy into Trump's racial appeals. And so at least this year, that's the attempt on the part of the Democrats. And I see, feels to me like it's not so much Trump leading a movement, it's that there's a movement there. He's identifying it clearly by the words that he speaks. And now there's something there that would be available for somebody more politically savvy with more organization. And, an open question as to whether this racial realignment that you've written about will be taken to a new level of extremeness.
I think I basically agree with that. I think the thing I wonder about is there still are a lot of forces within the Republican Party who I think would prefer a return to a very conservative party that makes implicit racial appeals, but doesn't take it to this explicit level, and that finds some ways on issues, for example, like immigration, to straddle just enough so as to get to not completely alienate all of the groups like Latinos, Asian Americans, and moderate whites. I think there's still a battle to come within the party. I don't think this is the complete victory of the Trump forces. And I guess what I would say is, in that battle, the one disadvantage that the Trump forces have is that it's not clear that they have the kind of institutionalized organization that say the liberals on the Democratic side had before. They clearly do have some media groups allied with them, but then there are other voices in the media, that in the conservative media that I think are skeptical of this as a winning strategy. And so I think it remains to be seen. I think the path you outline is definitely a plausible one. I'm not so sure that it's written in stone at this point.
We're getting close to out of time, but I wanted to just ask one thing about the way in which you wrote the book. So this podcast is based in some ways around trying to understand different ways to understand politics. And Sam comes at this from a more quantitative point of view. I come from a more qualitative point of view. But I think one of the things that readers who look at how books are written will find striking is some of the material that you used to get at this, to reach your conclusions about this realignment. Again, without going too much into the weeds, maybe you could just briefly tell us about the material that you used and the methods that you use as a political scientist.
Sure. I guess I'd say there are two main elements to it. One was a number of new data collections, so data on early public opinion on racial issues, data on state party platforms, which along with a collaborator I collected and coded about 1,000 state party platforms over a 40-year period, and data on members of Congress and their behavior that hadn't been used before. So for example, efforts to force items onto the agenda. So in some sense, kind of the basic empirical findings in the book come out of those kind of systematic quantitative explorations. But the broader kind of theoretical analytic argument, I think, really emerged from a lot of time spent in the archives, a lot of time spent reading old newspapers, CIO news, old coverage, to try to really understand what is it that happens in this period to change understandings of what it means to be liberal. And I think to do that, it wasn't enough just to look at the data, though the data was critically important in informing the hypotheses and in kind of a kind of backbone for the book, but it also required kind of immersing oneself in the period to really understand how did actors on the ground understand the terms of debate.
Well, thanks. That's going to wrap up our episode. I want to thank again Eric Schickler for speaking to us about this great new book, Racial Realignment, The Transformation of American Liberalism from 1932 to 1965. You can get it at bookstores. You can get it at all the major online outlets like Amazon. And I really do urge people to read this because I think it says a lot about our political situation today. So thanks for joining us, Eric.
Thanks, Julian and Sam. Enjoyed it.
And Sam and I will be back soon on Politics and Polls.
Take care, everyone.